Hello, everyone, and good morning. Welcome to today's workshop on the ABCs of clinical trials and how they can help you. Today, we will hear from 3 speakers who will talk about their experience with clinical trials and clinical trial research. If you have any questions throughout today's presentation, please type them in the Zoom chat Q&A box below. We will address all questions at the end of today's presentation during our Q&A session. And without further ado, please welcome our speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Stephanie Blank. Stephanie Blank is the Director of Gynecologic Oncology for the Mount Sinai Health System and a professor in the Department of Obstetrics, Gynecology, and Reproductive Science at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. She is also the Director of the Women's Cancer Program at the Blavatnik Family Chelsea Medical Center at Mount Sinai, and the Director of Oncology Programs, the Blavatnik Family Women's Health Research Institute. Dr. Blank specializes in treating patients with gynecologic cancers, including ovarian, fallopian tube, primary peritoneal, uterine, and cervical cancers, and in caring for women at increased risk of cancer. Dr. Blank has conducted extensive research on women's cancers on topics including genetic predisposition to cancer, novel treatment approaches, fertility preservation, survivorship, and quality of life. She is involved in the development of NCI-sponsored practice-changing clinical trials, and she has been a principal investigator for multiple clinical trials. She's also collaborated with other researchers in the Tisch Cancer Institute on translational research in fields such as immunotherapy and DNA repair. Dr. Blank is broadly published in peer-reviewed journals and textbooks and frequently presents at national and international conferences on women's gynecologic oncology issues. She is the recipient of many honors and awards, including the Castle Connolly Top Doctors, Super Doctors, and the Council on Resident Education in Obstetrics and Gynecology Teaching Award, among others. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Stephanie Blank.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you for having me here today. And I wanted to start with this graphic, which I really think is fantastic. And this is, I'm a women's cancer doctor, but everything I'm going to say applies to everybody. So I apologize that this slide is somewhat gynecologic focused, but there are so many exciting things about clinical trials. Something on this slide that I thought was extremely important is, when you think about clinical trials as a patient, you are not an experiment. The trial is designed to answer a question, but you yourself are not an experiment. And just to start, some of the goals of clinical trials are to explore and advocate for your own health, to access breakthrough therapies, to expand advances in personalized medicine, and to improve on the prevention, diagnosis, and treatment of all cancer. And so I'm going to just briefly go through some overview to answer a couple questions about clinical trials in general. Next slide, please. So what are clinical trials? Basically, clinical trials are research performed to see how a treatment affects somebody's disease. And we're talking about cancer, so in this situation, it's cancer. Importantly, clinical trials are the process through which standards of care are defined. They really move the care of people with cancer forward. They are the key to improving prevention, diagnosis, and safe and effective cancer treatment. Next slide, please. When we think about clinical trials, there are many types. You probably usually think about treatment trials. I'm going to get drug X and we're going to see how I respond to it. And that is a lot of the time, that's a type of trial you yourself might be actually seeking. There are other clinical trials as well. There are some that we would consider translational, or maybe we call it also biomarker. These are the types of trials where you might give tissue or blood, or some, your old tissue can be used to check things on a microscopic or molecular level to help us learn how cancer develops, which people might respond best to a certain drug, how drug affects the immune system, something like that. Also, increasingly important in clinical trials are quality of life. There was a time when the only thing that mattered is, did the tumor shrink? But now it also is extremely important is, looking at the whole human being. How is somebody feeling while they're getting a certain treatment? What are the side effects? And this is oftentimes studied through surveys and things like that. But the quality of life is extremely important, and it's also this is also called patient-reported outcomes. So this is really an important place for a patient voice to be heard in the development of standard of care. There are also prevention trials looking at, for example, we have a trial where people at increased hereditary risk of cancer do certain interventions to see if that will ultimately help. Sometimes trials are experiments, and sometimes they're just observational. Let's see how everybody who has this type of surgery does over the next 5 years. That's not really necessarily looking at two separate groups, but just seeing how things go with time. The other things that you want to think about when you think about clinical trials, who's sponsoring the trial? Sometimes it's sponsored by the government, an NCI trial. Sometimes it's sponsored by an institution or an individual investigator. And sometimes it's supported by industry, maybe the maker of the drug or whatever it is that you're using. Next slide, please. So there are different phases of clinical trials, and I just wanted to go through these briefly, and I'm going to sort of ad-lib a little bit about what you might want to know if you're considering these types of trials. So phase 1 trials are safety trials. These sometimes may be fairly new drugs that haven't been used in this specific disease before. Maybe they're used elsewhere. Sometimes there are first in human trials, but not all phase 1 trials are that. So the main goals when they're when people are designing these studies is to see what kind of side effects occur. These are also the studies that look a lot at pharmacology. These are the ones where you might have to have your blood drawn a lot to check for levels of a specific of the drug in your body. These are the trials that also tend to have the broadest inclusion requirements. These are the trials. People always get excited about these trials, but we don't always know. We hope that these agents that we're testing for safety will have an effect, but that's not statistically how the trial is designed. This still can get you access to very new and exciting treatments. So phase 2 trials are efficacy trials. This is once something has gone through, everything has to go from phase 1, 2 to 3, and then just to be clear about that. So after a drug or whatever type of intervention has gone through phase 1 and has been deemed to be safe, and the other thing about phase 1 trials is they determine the right dose of the drug to be given based on toxicities and such. It is then studied in a phase 2 trial, which basically it's not generally a trial that has more than one group. It's generally a trial where patients of a certain type are given a drug, and we see how it affects their cancer, and there are different things to look at the end, but just let's say how it makes the tumor shrink. And when these studies are designed, they're based on sort of the current. So let's say the current standard lets you generally 50% of people have a reduction in their tumor of 50%. When they're designing the study for phase 2, they're using that as sort of a standard. They're trying to see if something is better. You cannot go straight from phase 2 to this is the standard of care, because you can't really look at an old trial and try to compare things across trials. So if something in the phase 2 setting meets the, is better or meets the kind of predetermined success rate that the investigators determine, it will go on to phase 3. And phase 3 is when the new treatment is compared with the standard treatment. In these trials, these are oftentimes randomized. And what randomization means is that you're put in one of two groups, and it's done randomly. And there are a lot of different ways to do it. The most common way that we describe it is like flipping a coin. So half of the people get one group, one study, and one treatment, and half will get another treatment. And it's done completely randomly. And that's very important to avoid bias in a trial. So sometimes when people go into a phase 3 trial, most of the time they're hoping for the new treatment, but we don't always know that they're going to get it. But if you think about it, you're either going to get what you would get off trial versus the new treatment. And through phase 3 trials, that's how new standard of cares are developed. And then when there are successful phase 3 trials, that is when drugs or whatever it is go to the FDA and become approved for treatment of a certain disease. There's also phase 4 trials, and these are once a treatment has been approved and it needs to be followed over more time or given to more people, and that's a phase 4 trial. But these are the main ones that you will generally find. In general, if you're eligible for trials, you would first want to see if you're a phase 3, then a phase 2, then a phase 1. So you generally want to go in the one that's closest to standard of care to start. That may be slower for you to get the newest and greatest thing. So that's a choice you make, but that's generally how people approach trials in general. The other thing about phase 3 trials is that as you go up the sort of number of the phase is that the eligibility requirements get tighter and tighter. And the reason for that, it's not to leave people out of trials, but it's first to make sure that it's really to make sure that the study is as I'm going to say fair, it's not the right use, the right word really is unbiased. It's really to make sure that the study can answer the question that it's setting out to answer. Next slide, please. There's a lot of concern about safety in clinical trials, and I do want to just reassure everyone here that the clinical trials are extremely safe. Even beyond safe, there's evidence, and I believe that we'll hear a little bit about this later, but there's evidence that people on clinical trials actually have better care than those that are not exposed to trials. But just as I explained before, the treatments that are being tested on clinical trials have gone through years of intensive testing before they ever get to people. They are heavily regulated, and human subjects, meaning a person that's in a clinical trial, are protected through a lot of federal laws, institutional laws. Every trial, for example, before it ever gets to be presented to a patient to consider, has to go through a biostats review, a safety review, whether or not people are going to want to do it. And then there's the internal review board basically make sure that everything is safe. It's to protect the subjects. Now, while you're on a study, you're also being followed very, very closely in terms of lab work and scans and everything like that, so that we can keep a very close eye on every type of effect the treatment might have. Next slide, please. In terms of clinical trial costs, there's a federal healthcare reform law called the Patient Protection Affordable Care Act that actually requires private insurance to cover routine costs of care associated with clinical trials. The cost of research is paid for by the sponsor or the government. And of course, if you're considering a clinical trial, it's smartest to check with your insurance to confirm, but most often these are covered. Next slide, please. So of course, there are risks to clinical trials. New drugs and procedures may have side effects and risks unknown to the doctor, and that's part of the reason why you're followed so carefully. New drugs and procedures may be ineffective or less effective despite scientific data to suggest potential success. So something will never be tested against the standard of care unless we have data to support that it has potential to be as good as or not or better than the standard of care, but we don't always know that. And even if the new approach is effective, it may not work for you personally. We may not know, we may have a great treatment, but it may work on a certain subset of people and we don't know who they are as yet. Additionally, this isn't really a risk, but this is something that's important to know if you're considering clinical trials. Clinical trials are less flexible than general treatment. If you want to, there are certain days that you need to come for your treatment. You can't just wake up and say, I don't want to come. Of course, if you're ill, that's one thing, but you can't sort of arbitrarily change the dates of studies and treatment visits and things like that. It's done in a very pre-specified way, again, to make sure that the study has the best ability to answer the question that it set out to answer. Next slide, please. There are a lot of benefits to clinical trials too. You basically get your healthcare provided by leading physicians in the field of cancer research. Generally, people that participate in research, are keeping abreast of the latest and the greatest. You can access new drugs and interventions before they were widely available, and you'll hear from Leslie about that shortly. You can have close monitoring of your health and side effects. You yourself are taking a more active role in your healthcare. You're being asked about your side effects a lot more. You're a participant in your care to a greater degree as well. And if the approach being studied is found to be helpful, you're going to be among the first to benefit. And really, this is most important, but it's hard to, this is an opportunity to make a valuable contribution to cancer research, helping others diagnosed in the future. Next slide. So how do I find a clinical trial? The first thing that you should do is ask your physician about whether there are clinical trials. And it's important to know that that every clinical trial is not at every hospital. So sometimes you might need to ask your physician if he or she is aware of other ones. Now, it's a very big job to find a clinical trial. So if you want to look at what exists in the world for a clinical trial for your condition, clinicaltrials.gov is sort of the I don't know, the Bible of clinical trials, but it actually is a very difficult website to maneuver. And you're going to hear a little bit more about that as well. Sometimes Emerging Med is a different type of database to find trials, and it is a little bit easier to navigate. And there are ways to be connected with a clinical trial navigator, and Lazarex is which you'll hear about momentarily, serves in this role. So it oftentimes is a good idea to get someone to help you look through the clinical trials available. And there are many services that are they don't necessarily cost something, they're available online, and it's worthwhile looking. You may need to go to another institution to get the clinical trial you want, and that's acceptable. I wouldn't feel that you can't go there because you're not already there, because people really want the clinical trials to be available to patients. We want to get people enrolled in the trial so we can answer the questions. So you can go to another institution if need be. So how do you find a clinical trial? Once you find one, what types of things do you want to ask? You want to know what's being tested, and what's the schedule that you're going to need to go to the office? What kind of testing are you going to have done? How will it affect your treatment plan and life? Basically, if your doctor is not the person that's running the trial, how are those two people going to communicate to make sure that your care remains very comprehensive? What are the benefits? What are the risks? Are there side effects that seem more concerning? People always ask me, this is an aside, not on my list of questions, but people always ask me when they want to go into a trial, what does it work? But the answer is we don't know yet. So that part of that's not exactly the question to ask. You want to find out if you can drop out. Actually, the answer to that is you can always drop out of a trial should you want to. You're not signing, the next 6 months of your life to be committed to coming to the office every week. You have the ability to withdraw at any point. You want to ask about expenses. You want to ask about how are the study results going to be shared, and how is patient safety being checked as the trial is underway? A couple of more important things to ask before I end. If I go off this trial, can I get unblinded, for example? If you don't know what treatment you received, because sometimes you won't know, you might want to find out when you go off, if you can find that out, so you can know if that class of drugs can be of use for you in the future. You may want to know if the study is for a certain amount of time and you're benefiting, is there a way for you to stay on the treatment if you're benefiting, even if the trial is only for a certain number of cycles? Is there crossover? If I find out I'm in the control arm, can I cross over to the other arm? And then this is another important one. If I go on this trial, will this make me ineligible for trials or for other treatments in the future? Those are just a couple of things. It's a daunting process, but there are a lot of resources to help you, and it really does result in you getting the best care. It's how we move this science forward, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Blank. Now we are going to hear from Dana Dornsife, who is the founder and CEO of the Lazarex Cancer Foundation, which is a nationwide nonprofit organization she founded in 2006. The unique mission of Lazarex is to improve the outcome of cancer care, giving hope, dignity, and life to advanced stage cancer patients and the medically underserved by providing assistance with costs for FDA clinical trial participation, identification of clinical trial options, community outreach, and engagement. In 2016, Dana expanded the mission at Lazarex to bring sustainable and transformational change to the bench to bedside process of clinical trial enrollment, retention, minority participation, and equitable access with impact, which stands for improving patient access to cancer clinical trials. Dana is a graduate of Drexel University in Philadelphia and has launched several businesses prior to migrating to the nonprofit sector. She also serves on several boards. Most recently, Lazarex created collaboration around a public health initiative in Philadelphia, PA, called Community Impact. This bold initiative is aimed at creating a replicable model to transform cancer health outcomes and associated comorbidities for the residents of medically underserved and socioeconomically challenged minority neighborhoods throughout major metropolitan cities and beyond. Please welcome Dana Dornsife.
Thank you very much, Emily. I appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to address your audience today. Our organization exists to improve patient access to cancer clinical trials and also to improve the diversity of the participants in cancer clinical trials. And it's really hard, sometimes to understand the various challenges that exist for different communities. For instance, the African American community may have different challenges and barriers than the Hispanic community. It's really important that we tailor our efforts specifically toward those challenges in order to get better outcomes. We have to have adequate representation of all segments of our population in clinical trials in order to really understand the value, the efficacy that Dr. Blank was referring to, and how those clinical trials, the new drugs and new treatments work for all segments of our population so that we are developing drugs for all segments of our population. Next slide, please. So these are the barriers that Lazarex Cancer Foundation works with. The very first barrier is lack of knowledge. People really need to know about clinical trials if they're going to be able to make a decision as to whether or not they want to participate. And if they do decide to participate, the medical costs associated with clinical trials may be covered and the actual drug may be covered. But unfortunately, most of the time, the out-of-pocket expenses are not covered. And as Dr. Blank also mentioned, clinical trials aren't necessarily in your backyard. In fact, the majority of the time, people have to travel to get to a clinical trial, and this creates additional financial burden for them when they're already experiencing financial issues due to their cancer diagnosis. Also having to leave your support network at a time when you need them the most. You may be in a situation where your doctor has indicated you have limited time and you don't want to spend that time alone away from your friends and family. So Lazarex actually helps patients navigate through their clinical trial opportunities, identifies potential clinical trials, and then we actually provide financial assistance for a cancer patient to be able to travel to their clinical trial location and the expense of being accompanied by a loved one as a travel companion, because sometimes, in addition to not wanting to be alone, patients need help. They may not be able to drive. They may be in pain. And so you need someone with them. Then we have a whole nother set of barriers that is really important to address in relation to improving the diversity and access to our clinical trials. So first we have the historical barrier. There are many examples of medical abuses that have taken place throughout history. And these medical abuses have really led to deep-rooted fear and mistrust. And so we really need to overcome that before we can have a productive conversation around clinical trial participation for certain communities. We have cultural and language barriers that we need to address. And then finally, socioeconomic issues in relation to social determinants of health. If someone is able to even consider participation in a cancer clinical trial due to their personal situation, their work situation, where they live, their family situation, etc. Next slide, please. So this is the suite of Lazarex programs that we have developed over the course of time. We started out with our CARE program in 2006. It's a very unstructured program with a nationwide focus, again, providing clinical trial navigation and travel expense reimbursement, community outreach and engagement. It's really, patients just find us organically, and we look to increase clinical trial enrollment and diversity and provide equitable access to clinical trials through our CARE program. In doing that work, we realized that we had to take a more structured approach in order to have increased clinical trial enrollment and, more importantly, improved diversity in cancer clinical trials. So we launched our IMPACT program, improving patient access to cancer clinical trials, at certain comprehensive cancer centers nationwide. And we undertake specific activities during the consent process when a patient is inquiring about participating in a clinical trial. We refer them or introduce them to the financial reimbursement program, so that we can remove that financial concern right from the very beginning of that decision-making process. It also has community outreach and engagement component, and again, focusing on increased enrollment and diversity and creating a platform of equitable access. And while all of this is great, and we have had great results, which I will review with you shortly, we realized that where we really need to be is in the communities that are experiencing higher degrees of barriers. And that's really what led to our Community Impact program in Philadelphia. Community Impact is, again, highly structured. It has a very specific geographic focus where we go in and assess the social determinants of cancer. We identify and characterize cancer disparities, the incidence of cancer, prevalence, risk, mortality. And we have this programmatic work so that we can gain use it as a gateway into at-risk communities to address their specific challenges. So we create a baseline and an action strategy. Community impact is place-based and community-led, so we're where the people are, and it's culturally appropriate. It is facilitated by individuals who are from within the community where we work. So people feel more comfortable interacting with those individuals. And again, focusing on improved cancer health outcomes and equitable access to not just clinical trials, but providing a clear pathway to treatment and care. And at the middle of all of this sits our Cancer Wellness Hub. And this is our latest program, very much with a community focus, where we have a consistent presence within a community. And it's really meant to be a safe space where anyone can come to the hub and ask anything about anything related to cancer, whether it's prevention, diet and health, risk, better lifestyle choices, history of cancer. So, and really continuing across the continuum of cancer care. So starting with at the beginning with prevention, and then going through treatment and into clinical trial participation as well. Next slide, please. So this is the navigation and reimbursement process, basically, that we go through when we are contacted by any patient or any medical professional for all of our both our care and our impact program. So if it's required, we absolutely will identify clinical trial opportunities. Some patients call us, they're already enrolled in a trial. Some patients are being referred to us by medical professional, where their clinical trial has already been identified. But we also have lots of patients who need assistance identifying clinical trial opportunities. So we work with those individuals. It depends upon the type of cancer they have, what their treatment history is, their physical condition, if they're able to travel, what their family situation is at home. Many times, cancer patients have elderly parents that they're trying to take care of, or young children, that they're trying to take care of. So we try to identify the clinical trials that make sense for that individual. If that individual chooses to participate in a trial, and if they are accepted into that trial, we also then can provide financial assistance to them to help cover those burdensome out-of-pocket travel expenses. And we do this based upon a sliding scale, depending upon the total household income. So we really try to focus as many of our dollars as possible on the patients who really need it the most, so they can say, yes, I do want to participate in a cancer clinical trial. Then we generate an agreement. Every single patient we work with, we know them by name. We have very personal relationships with our patients. And then we get them enrolled in the reimbursement program, so that they are then reimbursed monthly on a very consistent basis, so they can get where they need to be when they need to be there. And our focus here is always increased enrollment and diversity, and creating a platform of equitable access. Next slide, please. For our community impact process, it's more community oriented, more neighborhood oriented, and again, working across the continuum of cancer care. So the first thing we do is we identify an appropriate location for our community impact program, and that's based upon level of need. We create the team that we want to work within that area or that community. So again, it's culturally appropriate. And then through doing focus groups, we conduct an assessment so that we really understand the challenges around cancer that that particular community is having to deal with. We formulate an action plan, and then we actually engage with the community and in the community. And we try and address their specific cancer health disparities and improve cancer health outcomes. And what we have found is that once we can get over that initial trust and fear barrier, that people are much more open to understanding what cancer is, what it is not, what trials are, what they are not, and how they can be proactive in their health and well-being in relation to cancer. And then finally, we measure the results. Are we getting these communities what they need? Are they doing better as a result of our activity? Next slide, please. So these are some of our results. And if you'll just look to the right side of the slide, I just want to compare our CARE program to our impact program over the same period of time, January 2018 through August 2020. Now, keep in mind that typically diversity in clinical trials, it depends on the study that you look at, but it is anywhere between 5 and 10% nationwide. With our CARE program, during this period of time, we were able to achieve 23% minority participation. With our impact program, which is the more structured program at the Comprehensive Cancer Center level, we were able to achieve 63% minority participation. So we do feel that the activities that we are undertaking, the actions that we are taking, are really allowing us to remove barriers for our most at-risk communities. Next slide, please. again, taking a look at household income data over that same time period, care versus impact. With our care program, 25% of our participants came from households earning less than $25,000 per year. With our impact program, 52% of participants came from households earning less than $25,000 a year. So this is clearly an indicator that household income, financial toxicity, the social determinants of health, socioeconomic status, all of those things really are a critical factor in relation to an individual's ability to actually participate in a cancer clinical trial, and that our program is very effective in supporting the decision to participate in a cancer clinical trial. Next slide, please. Some of the results from our community impact program through our focus groups, and I'm speaking about West Philadelphia specifically, which is primarily African-American Black communities. We were able to develop specific messaging and videos regarding that community's individual challenges around cancer. So again, place-based, community-led, culturally appropriate messaging. And we actually found that there was a significant difference in the challenges based upon gender. So we took it one step further and created a program around men conquering cancer together and around women conquering cancer together. Next slide, please. It's really important to keep in mind that you have to respond to the racial and ethnic makeup of the particular catchment area that you're working within. And that obviously changes depending upon where you're working. And what that means is that you will have to tailor your messaging accordingly, right? So you can see the difference between the Asian, Black, African-American, Latino, Hispanic, and white distribution between San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Philadelphia. So each of our programs needs to be tailored to the area that we're working in. Next slide, please. Finally, our conclusion is that while racial and ethnic diversity will be dependent upon local catchment areas, both care and impact data support the conclusion that universal implementation of a financial reimbursement program for travel costs is fundamental to removing a significant barrier to equitable access and increasing cancer clinical trial diversity. And we'd like to just give a shout out to the institutions who have participated, and of course, all of the patients who have participated in clinical trials. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dana. Last but not least, we will hear from former clinical trial patient Leslie Mason. In May 2014, Leslie was diagnosed with stage 3 ovarian cancer. Treated at Mount Sinai Hospital, Leslie was asked by her doctor and AstraZeneca to participate in a phased drug trial called SOLO-1 for a PARP inhibitor called olaparib. Leslie was part of the trial from 2014 to 2016. And in 2019, to mark her 5-year anniversary of being cancer-free, she became a volunteer at Women to Women. So please welcome Leslie Mason.
Thank you. I feel like I'm like SOLO-1 sounds like I'm from Star Wars or something. So I feel like my story is just very personal because it's just my experience, but I hope it's valuable in some way. I had the honor of meeting Dr. Blank 7 years ago when she was at NYU, and it was the day after I was diagnosed. I must have been shell-shocked and terrified, but she was brilliant and fabulous, and she had on the most beautiful red shoes, so I liked her right away. Dr. Blank had the task of telling me that my ovarian cancer was very serious, but that it was operable, so I needed surgery as soon as possible, followed by chemotherapy. She was also about to go away to speak at a conference and would not be able to treat me. So she gave me the benefit of her wisdom and her advice, and she suggested that I go and see Dr. Monica Prasad Hayes at Mount Sinai. I met Dr. Prasad the next day and was overwhelmed by her brilliance and her kindness. I remember her drawing a picture as she explained what was happening inside of me. The care with which she drew let me know I was in the right hands. I was also very reassured that both doctors had recommended the same treatment, and that while I was frightened, at least the path ahead was clear. I had surgery, and I was also tested for the BRCA gene mutation and found out that I was BRCA2 positive. About halfway through my many months of chemotherapy, Dr. Prasad came into the chemo suite to say hello and to speak to me about a drug trial for a drug called olaparib, which was a PARP inhibitor. She sounded very excited about the drug and said that olaparib was approved for BRCA positive women in the recurrent setting, and that this new phase 3 drug trial was to see what benefits there might be in taking olaparib after initial chemotherapy. Like many days during that year, I felt like I was underwater most of the time, and I could only hear about every other word when people were speaking to me. I could definitely tell that Dr. Prasad was excited and thought this would be a very good thing for me to do. And she seemed very confident that PARP inhibitors would be a big part of the future in cancer care. But I also heard the word reoccurrence, which was something I had never even considered as a possibility. And I also heard the word after, that after chemotherapy, I would have more treatment. What followed was one of the hardest moments for me. I opened my laptop and I began to search. And up came the statistics for ovarian cancer, BRCA1 and 2, success of PARP inhibitors in the recurrent setting, possible side effects versus quality and length of life, and on and on. I had searched before, and I even searched just yesterday to check a fact, but every time I'm shocked and still dismayed at what I find. For whatever reason, I find it so hard to see the positive information when I look on the internet about cancer. I think someone should just remove the search words from my computer hard drive. I was very fortunate at that time because as I sat there searching the web, Valerie Goldfein, who created the Woman to Woman mentorship program at Mount Sinai, came in to see how I was doing. Not good, I said, I'm searching on the internet. And she stopped me right away and said, my dear young friend, that way misery lies. If it isn't helping you, put it away for now. She then said the best thing about having cancer 14 years ago was that it was long before the internet had even been invented, which got us both laughing because, of course, the internet was definitely invented in 2000. Valerie Goldfein was and is my talisman through this ordeal. Hearing her say 14 years ago gave me hope and inspired me, and she is also the very best of company. She asked after my 9-year-old daughter, Lucy, and then she asked if I was BRCA positive, was I also Jewish? So I told her that I had recently discovered that I was, that for 51 years, I had no idea that my birth grandmother, whose name was Rhea, was Jewish, and that she had died of breast cancer when she was only 33 years old, and shortly after my mother had been born. My grandfather then quickly remarried, and Rhea was never mentioned again. When my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer at 65 and then died 6 years later in 1997, my family history was never discussed. I'm not sure she even knew about it. And the BRCA test had just been discovered, but it was not widely used in 1997. Neither my mother nor my grandmother had the benefit of having any of the care that I was being offered. And I realized how important it was for me to be able to change the trajectory of my family and to break this cycle. So for my sake and for my daughters and to honor my mother and my grandfather, I decided to do the drug trial. And for 2 years, I took 2 pills 2 times a day, and never in my life have I been so diligent and so well behaved. I'm usually rebellious and I am not a rule follower. I do not color inside the lines, but I took this drug every day without fail. The benefits were I was monitored very, very closely. Every 10 days at first, and then once a month, and then every 2 months and 3 months. And I still see Dr. Prasad every 6 months, and I love to see her. I had lots of scans and lots of people asking me how I was feeling. And sometimes it was annoying to be asked questions over and over again. I don't think I fully appreciated how valuable it was to have so many different people from so many different vantage points considering my care. I did not have many side effects except that my white blood cell counts were very low. And maybe I was more tired, and maybe I still had some numbness in my feet. But I'd been through so much chemo, it was a little bit hard to tell what the causes were. It took time to feel really well, but I do now. And I could never have imagined that olaparib would become the standard of care for ovarian cancer patients with the BRCA gene mutation, and that in some cases, women who do not have the BRCA gene would also benefit from the drug and its research. My daughter Lucy is 16 now, and she hears me talk about volunteering at Mount Sinai for Woman to Woman, and she's starting to be brave enough to ask some of these tough questions. I'm grateful to be able to say, look how much progress they've made in the last 7 years. Imagine what they will have discovered when you're my age. I hope she's reassured by this, and I hope she takes some pride in my being part of the trial. So thank you for listening to me talk about my experience.
Thank you so much, Leslie, for sharing your story with us. Here we just have listed some clinical trial resources. Dr. Blank mentioned most of them, but a few others that I'll highlight are NIH.gov and the Tisch Cancer Institute, which has a clinical trials office. Next slide, please. Now we will transition into the Q&A session. So if you have any additional questions, please type them in the Q&A section below. We do have a few, which I will read aloud. The first one is for Dr. Blank, and it is, how do you convince a patient who is scared or hesitant to join a clinical trial?
Well, thank you, Emily, and thank you, Lori, for asking that question. I wouldn't say I try to convince anyone to join a trial that they're scared of, but what I would do when I have a patient that just says, oh no, I don't want a clinical trial, I try to find out why it is that she is not interested. Sometimes it's because there's concern that they'll get a placebo, they won't get treatment when they need treatment, or concerns about ethics or things like that. I think that some of those, if it's related to something that is more of like a preconception than something true, I will try and work with the patient on that. If some patients just say, I'm not going in a clinical trial, and that's how it is. And sometimes it's because they want different flexibility or something like that. But I do try to approach how the patient feels about clinical trials in general. Sometimes it's about a concern about the drug, and I'll try to answer that. I mean, the informed consents, if any of you have read them for trials, are 50 pages long, and there's every side effect in there. They are a little bit scary, so just working through. I think it's extremely important that somebody be very comfortable with the trial. I would never want to, try to talk somebody into a trial if they didn't want to be on it. Sometimes patients say, well, what should I do? I'll do what you say, but I still want it to be the patient's choice. I would encourage somebody considering a trial to also involve their support team, be it, family members, friends, whomever helps you make medical decisions. And you don't really have to rush into these things. I think you should be pretty sure. Also, I don't think you should go into it expecting that you're going to not stay in it, but you should know that it's not a binding agreement. You can go at it any time, and that's very important. And I also like to make very clear to patients that not going on a trial is not going to make me mad at them in any way. I mean, it's an option. It's not the only option. You should always know every option when you're looking at a clinical trial. If I don't go on this trial, what are my other options? So asking questions, more discussion, and that's a great question. I hope that answered it.
Thank you so much. Dr. Blank, we have another question for you. It says, as far as published results, what is the typical timeline for achieving clinical results, given the road to complete remission for patients can be long and variable, and patients can usually drop out should they choose, necessitating replacement, patient-associated data. Also, could a high rate of dropouts cause a discontinuation of clinical trials / revisions of trial plan?
Another great question. So trials do take a long time to happen, and how long will depend on the design of the trial and what it's trying to find. So if the trial is trying to find how likely a certain treatment is to shrink your tumor, that type of trial is going to take a lot less time than something that's going to look at survival. For example, in ovarian cancer, people live a good amount of time, years and years. So any trial that's looking at overall survival is going to need to take years and years and years. But for an example, I mean, Leslie said that she was in the trial that she was in, I believe it was from 2014 to 2016. That trial was published in 2018. That's quick, but they were looking at not long-term survival, but we call progression-free survival at that point. So there will be more reports about the long-term survival, but it really depends on how it's designed. They don't give like updates in terms of publications, just sort of to make the study valid. You really have to wait till you have all the data and then report it. So it's not like you're going to get a halfway point update. The other question you had is that I'm looking at if people drop out of trials, can it cause discontinuation of clinical trials or revision of trial plan? That's another good question. So if a study can't accrue patients at some point, it's determined to be not feasible, and then it will be closed and they'll have to report what they have, but they might not have the ability to show what they wanted to. If there's a high rate of dropouts, the study might not be able to answer the question it's trying to ask. But what is the reason for dropouts? Let's say it's a new drug, and 60% of the people are dropping out because it causes a rash that nobody wants to deal with. Well, then that's not really a feasible treatment long term. So it may answer a different question than the one it's actually trying to ask. And your questions about remission taking a long time are very, very good. Usually a drug will start with a shorter term outcome to start and then go on to a longer term outcome. Like what Leslie said, the olaparib first started out as treatment and then in people that had a lot of prior treatment, but then by the time it got to her, it was moved way up front, and then that worked well. But they designed it in a way that they can answer the question quickly because it was such an important question. Thank you.
Thank you. We have another question saying, how long does the average clinical trial go for? I think you answered that pretty much. For Dana, incredible work. How do you recommend we can reach underrepresented communities in New York City from lessons that have been learned in Philadelphia?
Can you hear me, Emily? Okay, it's important to understand that right now our community impact program is in a pilot study. It's early days in relation to determining. It's our intention to build a replicable and cost-effective model to be able to take it from the Philadelphia area to New York City, to Dallas, to Chicago, lots of areas where we have many diverse communities in need. We are happy to share the process that we are undertaking. I do not have a specific answer regarding New York City. I can tell you that Lazarex Cancer Foundation has had to do a lot of policy and legislative work to create a permissible environment for trial sponsors and IRBs to support the work that we do. And we are actively working in the state of New York at this time to have our legislation passed there as well. that really opens up a lot of doors for us to be able to raise funding in order to support these efforts in expanded locations. So I'm happy to share what we know so far, happy to share the process that we're undertaking. We're still learning, developing best practices, and that's about the extent of what I'm able to comment on at this moment in time in relation to community impact. I do want to say that our CARE program, our everyday, clinical trial navigation and financial support program, is available to anyone, anywhere that is participating in a cancer therapeutic clinical trial in the United States. So if you know someone, please don't hesitate to refer them to us or call us, and we can walk you through the process.
Thank you so much. We have a few more questions, somewhat similar. How do you spread the word, Dana, about underrepresented communities? How can we spread the word to underrepresented communities in New York City? Is it all word of mouth, referral?
Well, it's all of it. If this was simple, it would be done, right? It's not. It's a heavy lift, and it really does take a lot of time, a lot of focused effort. We have got to be, place-based. We have to go where the people are. We cannot place additional burden on an already burdened community, right? So we need to go to the community. We need to have culturally available, appropriate individuals who are facilitating the program. We need to listen and understand what their individual challenges are. And then we need to create and provide solutions and pathways. It's not enough to just understand the problem. We really need to fix the problem if we're going to sustainably address cancer health disparities and improve cancer health outcomes.
Another question from Allison Davis, which I think you already answered. Are there any plans to expand Lazarex programs to the New York City area? Another saying, do you have any partnerships in New York City, Yonkers, Mount Vernon, which have large pockets of underserved patients?
So we do not currently. Again, our program, our community impact program and Cancer Wellness Hub are in pilot phases right now in community impact in Philadelphia, Cancer Wellness Hub in Philadelphia, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. And as soon as we are able to evaluate the activities that we're undertaking and create those best practices, we absolutely will be looking to identify new communities where, that has great cancer need, and to be able to bring the Cancer Wellness Hub to those communities.
Thank you so much. It looks like we have another for Dana. It says Philadelphia is such a university / teaching hospital research hub. As part of a push for community-led treatment and involvement, have you considered scope for students or working with students, volunteers, university student groups, where they may be able to help with transport? And then she says, thank you so much for all of your answers and time, especially Leslie. Very fascinating and empowering, and great to get a patient perspective.
So one of the reasons that we selected Philadelphia is because it is so rich in relation to the medical and academic resources that are there. And I'm actually from Philadelphia. So I have, a history of having lots of relationships with Drexel University is my alma mater. And in fact, the Cancer Wellness Hub in Philadelphia, we do actually work with Drexel University and the students to help man that Cancer Wellness Hub and to fulfill some of the activities that we are conducting there. And they love it. They cannot get enough of it. Unfortunately, COVID, has really limited the extent to which we can go, but that is starting to open up again. and we're very excited to get back to work.
Thank you. If anyone has any last questions, please type them in now. While we're waiting, I would just like to say a big thank you to the New York State Department of Health, who provided funding for today's workshop. And a big thank you to all of our panelists for your hard work on today's workshop. I really appreciate it. And it looks like we have no other questions. So thank you to everyone for participating and joining. We really appreciate it, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.